Hi, I'm August Sallas. I was formerly the president of the Chicago Typographical Union number 16, CWA 14408. During the time I was active in the Printers Union, I met Paul Simon at some reception, and he was a publisher of the Troy Times or Troy Tribune in Southern Illinois, and Paul Simon was a member of the International Typographical Union. So when I became president of the union, the Typographical Union here in Chicago, I made Paul Simon an honorary member and had him come to one of our union meetings, and I gave him a union card, and we became very good friends. As time went on, Paul Simon ran for U.S. Senate. Paul Simon to be on a TV show that I was doing called Political Roundtable, and I called his office down in Carbondale, and his secretary talked to me, and I told her what I wanted to do is I wanted to interview Paul Simon on my TV show. And she said she would get back to me, and she did, and she told me Paul Simon agreed to be interviewed by me on my TV show, and that he was going to be in Chicago on a specific date, and at that time I can meet with him and take him to the studio and interview him. He was speaking at the Chicago Historical Museum in downtown Chicago on the north side, and I picked up Paul Simon. He was by himself, and I took him to cable access to the studio there, and I interviewed him for an hour, and we had a very good conversation because he had just come back from Cuba. He was in Cuba with a delegation, and so we talked about Cuba, and I asked Paul Simon when did he meet President Fidel Castro, and he said he did. He said he didn't think he was going to meet him because the time frame was different, and I was canceled, he said, a couple of times. Finally, he did get to meet President Fidel Castro at midnight. He says, President Castro meets people at midnight. So we talked for 5 hours. And I asked him, I said, Paul, you talked to Fidel Castro for 5 hours. What did you talk about? He said, well, we talked about politics. We talked about the embargo. We talked about baseball. Fidel Castro liked baseball, and the Cubans liked baseball. And we talked about exchanging our teams, the Cubs going to Cuba, or the Cuban team coming to Chicago to play with the White Sox or the Cubs. And so we had a very long conversation. We talked about politics, and so they had a very interesting meeting with Fidel Castro, and we talked about his program that he had in Carbondale. He was the head of a department there, and then so that was our meeting for an hour that we talked, and then a couple of years later, I was reading the paper and I saw that there was an article about Paul Simon being in the hospital, that he was going to go to the hospital for a very serious operation. So I think it was St. John's Hospital in Springfield. So I called up the hospital and I asked to talk to Paul Simon, and they put him on the phone. And I talked to Paul Simon. I told him that I was concerned about him, and I told him I wished him luck with his operation. And I told him he was one of my favorite friends, and he told me I was his favorite friend. And we said goodbye, and about 2 days later he passed away.
Wow.
So I went to his memorial service that he had at Southern Illinois University, SIU. They had a ceremony there, and I went there, and it was a very interesting ceremony, memorial service that they had for Paul Simon. They had several good speakers. They had one of his, there's a young lady who spoke. She was Paul Simon's, I think, press secretary. And she said that she had an opportunity when Paul was alive to meet Paul Simon's mother. And she was at Paul Simon's house, and the mother showed her an album of newspaper clippings of Paul Simon in his political life. And she said, as I went through the albums looking at the different newspaper clippings, I came across an article there which was a skeleton. I call it a skeleton in Paul Simon's closet. What I found was that Paul Simon endorsed Tom Dewey for president. And you know that Paul Simon is a Democrat, but that's what he did. She said, I found a skeleton in Paul Simon's closet. And she was everybody laughed, of course, it was funny. But Paul Simon also had another speaker that was at his memorial service. He happened to be a Republican, ex-senator. And he said that one day during a Senate meeting, everybody all the senators, 50 senators, they all were wearing a bow tie. And of course that was Paul Simon's signature. Paul Simon always wore a bow tie. So he said, Paul Simon walked into the chamber, and all of a sudden he looked around and he saw all of these senators with bow ties. And he was surprised. It was a form of respect to Paul Simon because of his position. That everybody respected Paul Simon, and so they honored him by all wearing a bow tie. So Paul Simon was a great man. I consider him not a politician. I consider Paul Simon a statesman. He was a very honest public servant, and he served many years in office. And I really lost a good friend in Paul Simon. He was really a heartwarming guy, a caring person. He cared about people, and so paid my respect at the memorial service. And I met his daughter and other members of his family. Sheila Simon, really a nice person. I also gave her a copy of this videotape later on, and she appreciated that. So that's all on Paul Simon, and just missed a very good, honorable person. Thank you for watching.